Have you seen teachers posting on social media about hexagonal grouping activities? Now, I certainly have, and I got curious about how it works and how teachers are using it in their world language classrooms. I've seen Erin Coleman posting about it and presenting workshops on the topic, so I had to invite her onto the podcast to share with us how she uses hexagonal grouping with her students. Erin shares lots of ideas and pro tips so that you can start using them right away with your students. So let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and you are an incredible language teacher because you're listening to a podcast about language teaching. So just the fact that you're doing that, I don't know if I know you, but I do know that you're listening to a podcast about language teaching. So thank you for going that extra mile and just being an incredible educator. So today we're going to be talking about hexagonal grouping. Maybe you've seen it, maybe you haven't, but you're going to know a lot about it after today's episode. Joining me today to talk about her own personal experiences with it with lots of insights and recommendations is Erin Coleman. You may know her from her website, which is the Engaged Spanish Classroom. You might see her all over social media under that same name, where she is offering lots of proficiency-focused ideas and insights and activities for teachers. So she has been a Spanish teacher for about 10 years, and she is here in Massachusetts, where I am. We just realized that we live less than a half an hour from each other, and we've never actually met in person. She is very involved in online conferences. She has presented several times at Practical and Comprehensible, as well as the World Language Teacher Summit. So you can catch her at those yearly. She's pretty involved with those. Erin, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I can't believe that we're both so close and we had no idea.
Funny the way the world works sometimes. So I mentioned that you have spent a number of years teaching Spanish in the classroom, but in the last couple of years, you've transitioned from the world language teaching classroom, teaching Spanish, to doing a little bit more of instructional design, I guess, in the corporate world. Can you talk to us a little bit about that transition and what you're using from your years in the classroom with students in that instructional design world?
Having two young kids at home, I have sons that are 2 and 4, and I really just decided now would be a good time for me to try something that would allow me to spend more time with them, see them in the mornings. So I decided to make the leap to instructional design, and I have been loving it. Former teachers are really super valued in this field because we bring the confidence of delivering in front of an audience of many of us have large classes, larger than we'd like sometimes. But we have that confidence. We have that ability to present and engage our audiences. And we also have the, lesson planning and design expertise because many of us haven't had curriculums and we've had to make our own content for years and years. So bringing that balance is definitely unique to the instructional design world, and it's great for teachers.
Right. And I love that you're keeping your place amongst language teachers by continuing to create resources and to present on these topics. And you are still a Spanish teacher, even though I see you're doing this instructional design. You are definitely still a Spanish teacher with everything that you're doing. The fact that you're here on a podcast talking to me about language teaching, you're clearly still a Spanish teacher at heart, if nothing else, right?
Yes. Thank you. That means a lot to me. And I've been loving it. And I love things like this because it does help me feel like I'm still in the education world, which is what I love. So thank you so much.
Let's get going on this conversation about hexagonal thinking. And first, I would like to know, before we get to exactly what it is and how to do it, and that's all the fun stuff we do on the podcast, how did you come across this and why did you even try it out in the first place?
My oldest sister, I'm one of 4 girls, and my oldest sister has been a teacher for over 20 years, and she teaches in Lowell, actually. So now that
Mhm.
I know you know the area, that's where she is. I want to say it was 2 or 3 summers ago, she went to a professional development during the summer, and she called me right after, and she said, I need to tell you about this activity because I don't want to forget about it, and I want to try it, and I think you should try it. I think your students would love it. And she told me all about it. I had never heard of it before. I loved it right away. And I actually went home and started prepping a few versions to use. As I mentioned, it was over the summer. So I started prepping
Mhm.
versions over the summer to use in the fall.
And this particular activity, this hexagonal grouping, was she at a language conference, language teacher conference,
No,
or
she teaches
was
science.
okay? So this was something that you've taken that you've heard about in another realm, and you've found ways to
Hmm.
adapt it to the language classroom.
Yes, exactly. She teaches science. She has taught middle school science and high school science for over 20 years. And so when she was explaining it to me, she was using science vocabulary and trying to give
Mhm.
me examples. And it was a little over my head. But when I made my first set, I met with her and I was like, okay, is this how they did it? Is this how it went? And she was like, yes, that's it.
Yes.
And we both got so excited about it that summer, and she's been using it in her science classroom since then, and it's been great.
But I love that idea of taking these ideas that they're not necessarily language specific and adapting them and using them in our classrooms, because sometimes what happens in our language teaching world is we can be a little siloed and we keep modifying and changing similar activities that are happening
Hmm.
within our language teaching realm. But then it's good to have those things that come from the outside of our immediate world and find those ways to adapt them. So let's
Yeah.
talk about exactly what this hexagonal grouping is. Can you tell us about it? What is it and why is it effective in an educational context?
The way that I like to set it up is, obviously you have these hexagon shapes, right? And so the version that I use, I have created a template that has space for 33 because I've just found that if you want to do a smaller group of vocabulary, you can, but the larger the better. And if students don't use all of them, that's okay. It's okay to have extras. You just want to be sure to give them plenty of options to consider. So you start with 33 hexagons and each one has one word on it. It can be vocabulary focused, it could be grammar focused, it really could be any theme that you choose. And your challenge to your students is, hey, you have these in front of you, and you can have them on paper or drag and drop digitally as well. But hey, you have these vocabulary words in front of you. I would like you to arrange them, and hexagons are great because they connect so well, right? You're arranging them in a shape and you can build and build and build. Honestly, when I was developing this activity, I tried things like flowers or rain clouds with raindrops, and nothing was as good as hexagons. So that's why I
Mm-hmm.
stuck with it. Your challenge to your students is, can you arrange these in a way that makes the most sense to you? Can you group these words in a way that you can explain to me, that you can give me a reason of why you grouped these together? And typically the instruction I give students is I would like to see them make at least 3 groups out of the vocab words, because it's very easy for them to, have group A and group B and be splitting things in half. But challenging them to have at least 3 groups kind of promotes that critical thinking there.
So just to make sure, in case anyone's questioning it right now, hexagon, how many
Mm-hmm.
sides is that? So we're talking about six-sided shapes, right? So I think it's one of
Yes,
those things.
yes,
We say hexagon just to make sure we're like, okay, so it's six-sided. That's
yes,
what that is, right?
yes.
And so you have this idea of grouping them. And so just to maybe point out the obvious, but just to make sure I'm thinking about this correctly, when students are engaging in this, there's no right or wrong answer, right? They are
Exactly.
finding what that means. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Because we're so used to sort of like there's a right and wrong answer to come up with.
Mm-hmm.
So talk about that in terms of like critical thinking that might be involved or things like that.
Yeah. So one of the reasons I got so excited about this when my sister presented the idea to me was I've been, my last few years of teaching, I was really focused on switching from a traditional gradebook to a proficiency focused gradebook and what students can do rather than the things that they can't do. How they are able to communicate in the skills that they do have, focusing on all of those positives rather than, you missed an accent here and I'm taking off a point for that.
Mm.
The idea of this activity where you're putting the power in the student's hands and there's no wrong answers, it really excites me that they get to build confidence right away. So I love doing this at the very start of a unit. maybe when they've seen the vocabulary just for a day or so, using it as an opening activity then is really, really great for their confidence. Your students might really impress you because let's say we have a version that is vacation vocabulary. That's one that I like to do. Our Spanish threes have an awesome unit on that. So vacation vocabulary that they can work in pairs or on their own or in small groups. That's up to you as well. Mm-hmm. But so I typically like to have students work on it on their own the first time we do this. And I have seen students with vacation vocabulary make groups that I've never thought of. Like I had a student make groups of things he had done versus things he had never done versus things he would never want to do. So like things he would be scared of. Other students organize vacation vocab of here are things that you do in the city. Here are things that you do on the coast. Here are places that you visit that are indoors versus outside experiences. Things that you do with your family versus things you do with your friends or on your own. The exciting thing is that none of these are wrong. And so students are so excited to explain their reasoning and, oh, well, I made these 4 groups because of this and this and this. But the person next to them has completely different groups, or maybe they might have one group that overlaps or has similar words, but it could be for a completely different reason. Mm-hmm. Some students choose to focus on the Spanish, the world language aspect of it, of the construction of the word or the spelling or the sound of the word, pronunciation. They could make connections there. It's just really so cool and creative and gets that, like you mentioned, the critical thinking, it gets that part of their brain working. It's always okay to let them know they don't have to use all of them. They can leave some on the side. I like to see all of my students leave the same ones on the side because that's a good insight too for us, right? Do we need to review these if students left the same 5 alone? Everything is good insight for us.
So I'm working with these and I have this hexagon. So what does it look like? What are you actually putting on there?
To continue with the vacation theme example, each hexagon, and we mentioned we use 33, each hexagon is just going to have one word in the center. Mm-hmm. And so let's say the one word on the one that I'm holding is La Costa. Mm-hmm. And a student is holding another one that says La Catedral. Mm-hmm. And these students are probably going to put those in different groups. Mm-hmm. And now they're going to go back to their pile and look through and say, okay, can I see any vocab word in this pile that relates to La Costa? Oh, here's nadar. I'm going to put that with La Costa and I'm going to keep building out this group. I feel like I have a good theme here. And then maybe I find El Museo and I'm going to put that next to La Catedral or La Ciudad. And I'm going to start building that group out. And then maybe I find another word that says Las Montañas, and I'm going to start a third group because I feel like that doesn't really go with Nadar, La Costa, doesn't really go with La Catedral. I'm going to start my third group over here and see what I can build off. So there's just one word per hexagon. And that's why I really recommend giving no fewer than 20 because you want your students to have a wealth of words to start with.
And so you mentioned the idea of using vacation. Can you give us some other themes or concepts you use when you're grouping your words?
Sure. So school vocab is a really interesting one because I've seen students be very literal and, okay, these are things that we write with. These are things that go in my backpack. These are class names. But then I've also seen students make groupings of like, oh, these are all the subjects. These are all the classes that I have before lunch and all of the activities I do before lunch. And then here is my middle of the day school life. And here is my after school practices, sports, things like that. And so it's so interesting to see how students break them down. So school life, vacation, I've done food is a really great one. And that always gets very heated. Students love to argue that doesn't belong with that, It's great to see the discussions that come up too. But also you can do grammar topics and you might assume that students are going to group all the yos together and all the, matching conjugations together, but you'd be surprised that they really do find other ways. And they are really proud of their reasons.
The language comes in and then the explaining and why, and that's where the critical thinking and the language comes in. So I'm starting to put the pieces together with that. You had mentioned that sometimes you do it with the physical paper and sometimes digitally. What has been your experience with either one, and would you give a recommendation in either direction or leave it up to the teacher?
It's totally up to the teacher because I think we all have our own preferences here. I personally love the paper. I love having the manipulatives, the physical ones. I have shown on social media a few times my very elegant filing system of Ziploc baggies that I keep activities in from year to year once, once I cut them out. But so once you cut them out, you can save them from year to year. And a good way to keep the sets separate is I'll write like the letter A on the back of everyone in one set. And then I'll write the letter B on the back of every hexagon in another set, so that if a student drops them on the ground, you can tell where they came from.
Have you ever had students create their own, where you give them blank ones and they have a list and they create them on their own? Or are you typically using your template and providing in advance?
I usually provide it, but I feel like that could be really exciting too, and especially if you're giving the students the power to choose the words, because maybe then they have an idea of groupings. When we give our students these vocab lists, we have an idea of the groups they're going to come up with. But as I mentioned, we're always surprised and impressed with the different ways that they organize these. I feel like that would be such a cool approach to see what do they even put on the list. For their peers, and where do they see it going, and do their peers surprise them? Because you could ask them after, did these students group them the way that you thought they would, or did they come up with any you hadn't thought of? Oh, I love that.
Yeah, it's just getting the wheels turning with different ways to go about it. We are looking at this idea of the in the moment where they're putting them together. So in terms of prepping students to be able to do that, you had said that you kind of do it early on when they're newly engaging with the vocabulary. What's the reason for that?
At the start of something new, I always really want to focus on building their confidence. So at the start of every unit, I'm focusing on interpretive mode. I want them to do activities like pasitos, is where I'll put a sentence on the board and students step to the left or to the right based on their opinion, and the options are all on the board for them. I really like to do very structured things where students are able to produce and feel like they are engaging with the language and doing things correctly without feeling like somebody is taking off points or judging them or being like, nope, you didn't get that right. So this is just another activity that is great for building their confidence at the start of the unit, and it's getting them engaged with your new content hands-on right away. They're not just sitting and passively listening to you. They are exploring the content right away.
And so now let's look at what are some possible follow-up activities. So once they've done this, then what do you have students do with what they've created and this little world of connections?
Yeah, so a couple options. Students usually like to take pictures of the groupings that they made. And so then they might walk around and kind of do like a gallery walk. We might leave them all on the tables because my students sit in groups of 4 or 5. So leave them all on their desks. Everybody gets up and we walk around the room and they explore other students' groups and see the groupings they made, because we likely can't explain all of them in front of the whole class, right? We can't have all 30 students explain their groupings. But if we treat it like a gallery walk type thing, which I love to do, it gives them an opportunity to kind of peek into another student's brain, and they usually figure it out, like, oh, I see why you did this. Oh, whose desk is this? That was really good. I almost grouped mine this way, but I couldn't think of enough. And oh, look, you got so many here. Like, this is great. You could also, in a similar way, if you didn't want them to move, you could have them write them down and upload them to a class folder. There's lots of opportunities to compare. And it's always nice to see students talking to another student that they might not normally, if it's somebody on the other side of the room from them, but they're like, oh, hey, you did great. I love this. Or, hey, I don't understand this. Why did you group these like this? And then that student usually rushes over to explain, and they're all proud. And it's just so great to see.
Have you ever had them do any writing after it, or do you keep it more the verbal communication?
I've kept it verbal, other than writing their list and their explanation just to like hand in to me as an exit ticket. Because like I said, I can't typically hear from all 30 students in the moment, but I am curious. And it's good to see what words were left out. Like I mentioned, if no student has used, one of the vocab words, I know that we have not spent enough time on it. Or if it's a grammar focused and they all avoided all of the irregulars or something like that, it's really good for us to know that. So writing it down, handing it in to me. But as far as extension, I haven't, but I feel like the world is your oyster. I feel like you could go anywhere from here. You could build a story. You could do anything.
I appreciate how you mentioned the noticing the words they're using or not. So it's a formative assessment for you as you're going around. It's really good feedback for you. And have you thought about even possibly using this as more an IPA or an actual assessment, or do you keep this more as being engaged in the classroom? Now, I know your website is the Engaged Spanish Classroom. So as I'm saying it, I'm like,
Very
are you
on
keeping
brand
it
for
engaged?
me.
Yeah, I'm like, I think she's going to stay on brand with this and say it's more of like engaging in the
Yeah,
classroom. But do you see,
it
are
is.
there maybe some assessment, more formal assessment rather than just the formative assessment possibilities with this?
I think you absolutely could. I have not personally. I keep it just for the, getting them engaged, getting them excited and confident about the language, which is very on brand. But you could absolutely have a formal assessment where your students are, you ask them to, they need to submit 4 groups and they need to have a reason. I personally would find it hard to take off any points. So for me, that would be an assessment that if you do it and if you do a good job justifying, you got it.
Hmm.
And if not, maybe it would just be a please try again situation.
Hmm.
I wouldn't want to turn this into an activity where you're taking off points because I want students to be confident in their skills and
Hmm.
confident to share their thoughts.
I guess in terms of the using it as an assessment, I was thinking like if it was a presentational writing assessment and it was the way they did their outline or brainstorm was using them. So you weren't
Mm,
necessarily looking at the content, but more the use of the vocabulary and the connecting words and things like that. So it's not sort of
yeah,
the judgment on what they actually
how they
grouped,
did.
but more how they wrote about it. I'm always like the wheels are always
That's a
turning.
great
I'm like, what am I
idea.
going to do in class with this tomorrow?
How can I use this? How can I make them write? How can I make them produce? Yeah, no, that's, and honestly, if you did this activity at the start of your unit and then you built up to that and they knew the vocab and they knew what was coming, I feel like that could be very powerful.
To kind of finish off for the discussion of that, do you have some pro tips or strategies that you can leave with us that make sure you do this, try not to do that? I tried this and it didn't work. Do you have any pro tips for us?
Give your students the opportunity to do it on their own first. And then after they have done the activity at least once or twice, then absolutely pairs, or I don't usually do groups larger than 3. So pairs or groups of 3 for this works great. But having them try in a group first, somebody usually overpowers and kind of takes over. So you want them all to be comfortable with what the activity is, and have them all be comfortable with. Wait, no, my ideas are valid. I've done this before too. Let's dive in
Hmm.
together rather than me just deferring to your
Hmm.
thoughts. So definitely encourage your students to do it on their own first. And then I really just think, I know we all use devices, and I know that sometimes it's easier to use the digital version, but if at all possible, if you need to have students help you cut them out, if you can do it on paper and then save them to save yourself work later, I really do think that that's worth the extra effort.
In terms of time, so I'm thinking I'm going to try this the first time. And do I give everyone the same amount of time? I haven't done it. So I'm going to ask you, what is that amount of time that you should give the entire class to be working on it before they're ready to share out?
I would say at least 7 to 10 minutes. So I like having my students enter and the hexagons are already on their desks. So they come in and it kind of works twofold, right? They see that and they want to get started right away. And so some students might have a few extra minutes if they got to class early, but you definitely want to give them, I think 10 minutes is a healthy goal for allowing them to organize, because they also might talk to one another while they're doing it about their groupings, and they might decide to change their groupings halfway through. That's fine too. So you want to
Hmm.
give them that opportunity to be flexible and feel confident. And their goal is to use as many as they can. And sometimes that involves changing their groupings to say, oh, well, if I change it to this, I can now use all of these over here too. So
Hmm.
let me do that. And I love seeing that thought process. And I don't want them to feel rushed during that. So I'd say 10 minutes. And then I would say, spend 5 minutes asking anybody if they would like to share their groupings and why. And usually, once the first person goes, the conversation flows from there because
Hmm.
somebody did something similar or wants to point out one difference, and it flows pretty easily from there.
That was lingering in my mind. I'm just thinking, okay, how long should I have them on task? As we sort of wrap up this conversation, do you have any recommendations for teachers about teaching in general, or it's something you're listening to, watching right now?
Yeah, so it's funny you say listening to because I've been very into audiobooks lately, and I
Uh-huh.
don't know how I'm so behind the game on
Mhm.
this, but now, walking the dog, cooking dinner, I have my headphones in and I'm listening, and it's great. I have really been loving Brene Brown and her books Dare to Lead, and she has a handful of others, and she's not speaking directly about teaching, but I feel like it speaks to me about teaching and about my relationship with teaching and about how I value myself and my skills. I just really encourage if there's anybody out there, first of all, if they haven't tried audiobooks, to try them. They're
Mhm.
great. But Brene Brown, and I just love that she is the one narrating them as well. And it's just
Mhm.
been so powerful.
I'm a big fan of Brene Brown myself. She had a special
Yes,
on Netflix, I believe it was. So you can even see it on there. She's very funny, so
she
listening
is.
to her read her book, I'm sure that there are little parts in there where her humor is able to come in. So definitely
Mhm.
something to check out there. So, how can our listeners be connecting with you?
So my blog is, and my website is just the engagedSpanishClassroom.com. And there's actually near the top, there's a blog post about the topic of this
Hmm.
hexagonal grouping. So I highly encourage them. And there's pictures so that they can see what the hexagons look like with the one word and how the different groupings could look like. So
Hmm.
that's great to check out right after they listen to this. And otherwise, I do have a Facebook, but I'm mostly on Instagram. And I love chatting with people. Will tell you I love chatting lesson ideas. And so you can find me there
Hmm.
at the Engaged Spanish Classroom, and I'm happy to connect.
As we get ready to say our goodbyes, I like to leave our listeners with a hearty piece of advice. So, what can you leave us with?
So I would say that, as teachers, we so frequently put our classrooms and our students before ourselves. By nature, we want to take care of others and make sure that others are, have what they need and we are doing the best that we can for them. And I just really encourage you to take care of yourself and put yourself first and just remember that you are doing an amazing job. Nobody is perfect. You don't have to be perfect. And please, spend time with your family and your friends, and you deserve all of that. And you are still a good teacher.
Well, as I said at the very beginning, the one thing I know about you is you are listening to a podcast about language teaching. So, we already know you're great. So, take care of yourself and keep being great. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Erin Coleman, and sharing everything that you're doing with hexagonal grouping and giving us this new insight into a really creative idea that we can be doing in our classrooms with our students. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
What are your takeaways from that conversation with Erin Coleman? Are you thinking of some themes for using hexagonal grouping with your students? Be sure to check out the show notes to connect with Erin Coleman. You'll also see the link to sign up for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. There are also links to get in touch with me if you'd like to work together, and we can do that in person in your school or remotely. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Let's keep the conversation going on social media. Connect with me on X, aka Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WL Classroom. And for even more valuable resources, visit my website, WLClassroom.com, where you'll find over 300 blog posts about language teaching. So stay inspired, keep growing, and continue making a difference in your language classroom.